Chapter 3. By the time Hector and I were the first couple, I danced gaily with no misstep, reaching out with my right arm to my partner and then with my left for a turn with every man in the line. To keep from wilting under the gaze of the sandy-haired man, I forced a smile for all. This touching of arms was something new, and later I wondered if touching was the purpose of the dance, a device to put men and women in brief contact, with the music making everything seem proper. Before Hector led me onto the dance floor, I'd touch no part of any man but the limp hand of our preacher after each Sunday's sermon. I could not deny to myself how excited I felt, arm in arm with the sandy-haired man. When the dance ended, I returned to my cousins, exhilarated but hot. They stared like they weren't sure they knew me, eyes wide but smiling. Mary Agnes tugged on my hand. "Show me how to do that." The music started again, this time a waltz. "I've got you for the next reel," Hector said. "I wanted to dance, but not with this boy. I shouldn't dance again until my cousins have had a turn," I said. A tall figure edged past me to Mrs. Bond. "Ma'am," he said, "may I have the pleasure?" It was the sandy-haired dancer. Beaming, Mrs. Bond took his outstretched hand. "Indeed you may." We watched them glide around the room among the other dancers. "All right, let's dance," Hector said to Mary Agnes. His tone said, "Let's get it over with." But Mary Agnes was happy. She handed me her cup, half full of something cool and sweet. I finished it because my throat was parched. "He's nice," Margaret said. Startled, because I was already thinking about somebody, I said, "Who?" Mrs. Bond and her sandy-haired partner whirled past us, her hand on his shoulder and his broad hand at her waist. "Hector," Margaret said. "It's nice of him to dance with us." I turned to see Hector, who guided Mary Agnes in circles near the wall, saying, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Mary Agnes stepped awkwardly, but she picked up the rhythm. Leola shuffled beside me in imitation of their steps. Margaret looked anxious, but refrained from doing anything that might reveal her desire to dance. The floor was a turning wheel of black and white and browns, working people in their sensible attire. I didn't have to search among them for Mrs. Bond and her partner, for his blue checked shirt stood out. Mrs. Bond was a hefty woman but light on her feet. To my eyes, her partner was not just good. He was perfect. I wondered if they knew each other and if they had danced together before. The waltz seemed to last forever, and couples stopped dancing before the music ended, including Hector and Mary Agnes. Mrs. Bond and her partner, however, danced on, and as the floor became less crowded, it seemed like everyone who wasn't dancing was watching them. I felt a blush creep up my neck. I wasn't watching them. I was watching him. At the end of the waltz, he and Mrs. Bond went to the refreshment table, then came back to us carrying their cups. They stood beside Hector and Mary Agnes. "Did you see me? I waltzed," Mary Agnes said. She reached for the cup in my hand. "I'm sorry," I said. "I drank it. I'll get you another." I hurried away to the refreshment table, wondering if he was watching me. That was silly. He'd smiled at me one time. He'd smiled at Mrs. Bond and my cousins, and likely at every woman in the room. "May I offer you some refreshment?" It was a man's voice. When I looked up, a man with a large stomach held out a cup of the sweet punch. "Thank you, I should buy my own," I said. I moved to the table, my coin ready, wondering what I might have done had the offer come from the man I couldn't stop thinking about. As I paid my money and picked up a cup, the man said, "I'll be coming for a dance." I gave a weak nod of my head, for since I'd come to the social to dance, refusing seemed rude. After that, I danced every number, for someone always seemed to be waiting with an outstretched hand each time I returned to our place at the side of the room. My partners were men and boys of all ages, some who merely rocked me side to side like they'd never danced before. Meanwhile, the sandy-haired man was always whirling by, dancing a turn with each of my cousins, and, it seemed, with every other woman and girl in the room. I danced with Hector again, the next Virginia Reel, for which the sandy-haired man chose Margaret as his partner. When that dance was over and we returned to our places, he held out his hand to me. "Last dance," the fiddler called. My shoes had rubbed raw blisters on my heels, but I couldn't confess my discomfort, no more than I could miss this opportunity. Afterwards, I thought we'd probably waltzed. He'd said his name, Jamie Long, and I'd said mine, May Rose Percy. I was barely aware of the music, conscious only of how he swirled me around the room, his hand on the small of my back and my hand on his shoulder, the pair of us so close together I could feel his breath. It was over too soon. The room grew dim. Someone was turning down the flames in the gas lamps. Voices groaned and the crowd began moving toward the open doors. "We'll dance again," he said. I looked into his eyes and smiled. Then I was outside, the sweat of my face and neck drying in the cooler air, hurrying along with Mrs. Bond and my cousins to the streetcar. Hector squeezed into a seat beside me and started to jabber about something. I didn't hear a word. The next days were very warm, and by evening the upstairs rooms were so hot we could not sleep. Mrs. Bond had no porch, so like every other householder on the street, she set a few old chairs on the brick walk, and we sat there late into the night, talking softly and saying hello to people who were out walking in the cooler night air. Ever since the social, I'd secretly watched for Jamie Long, though I knew I was now in a city where I might never see the same person twice. On this dark night, I could not be sure, but I felt myself growing weak, witnessing the approach of a man with a familiar, graceful stride. "Why, it's Mrs. Bond," he said, lifting his cap. Then he turned and tipped his cap to us, saying, "Young ladies, how are you this evening?" Lamplight from the windows showed the tanned face of a man with laughing eyes and a smile that turned up on one side. Mrs. Bond greeted him like an old friend. "Mr. Long," she said, "do sit a spell." "Thank you, but I was on my way to the lemonade stand at the railroad station. Would you ladies care to join me?" Mary Agnes and Leola leaped from their chairs and pulled on my hands. "May we? May we?" "We can all go," he said, looking at me. "I'm not certain we should," I said. "Mrs. Bond, will you be going?" "I'm dead on my feet, but you girls go along," she said. "Mr. Long will look after you, ain't that right, Mr. Long? I'll send Hector, too." "Hector!" She peered up and down the street. "Where'd that boy get to? Never mind, you'll be fine. You should get there and back with time to drink your lemonade. Say 30 minutes in all. I'll wait right here." 30 minutes. Mary Agnes took Mr. Long's hand. He offered his arm. "Anyone else?" he asked. Quickly, Leola hooked her arm through his. "May Rose," Mrs. Bond said, "you and Margaret walk ahead so Mr. Long can keep an eye on you." I would rather have walked behind, though I told myself there was no reason he'd be watching me. Nervous all the way, I was relieved to reach the lemonade stand, and I stepped aside to calm my fluttery breath while he stood in line, buying for us all. The lemonade was lovely, tart, sweet, and refreshing, and when we drained our glasses, Leola and Mary Agnes claimed him once again for our return to the house where Mrs. Bond was waiting. We thanked him, and he shook all our hands, starting with Mrs. Bond and ending with me. "He likes us," Leola said when we reached our room. "He likes May Rose," Margaret said, pulling off her shoes. "He's after her." "He's not," I said, though I was still quivering from the press of his hand against mine. The next day I was conscious only of the pouring rain and the likelihood there'd be no visit from Jamie Long and no evening walk. I'd wanted to wash my hair, but its length and thickness required hours to dry, and that day we had neither sunshine nor a hot fire indoors. Though our plans for the evening were uncertain, I brushed a bit of powder through my hair and pinned it up. Then the rain stopped. There was no good reason to sit outside that evening, for the rain had cooled the house, and Mrs. Bond said the streets were too sloppy. But after the evening meal, we sat in the parlor, and she left the front door open. And he came. "Ladies," he said, standing in the hallway, "I'm sorry to say it's a poor night to walk out." "You're right about that," Mrs. Bond said. It's more a night for tea and a taste of something sweet, don't you think? She lifted a platter of shortbread. Do come in and sit down. Mary Agnes, scoot over there with Leola and give Mr. Long your chair. Mary Agnes's chair was beside Mrs. Bond and directly across the small room from me. When he sat down, I didn't know where to look, though I knew what I wanted to see. I tried to hide my interest by passing my glances around the room. "Thank you kindly," he said. During Mr. Long's visit, Mrs. Bond quizzed him about his work, his family, and his future plans. So we learned he was working on the docks but intended to travel west or north as soon as he had an opportunity. He didn't say what kind of opportunity. Of his family, he said only that his parents had passed away. Mostly he spoke of catching trout in mountain streams, and though I doubted any of us cared about fishing, we were captivated by the exciting way he told a story. Forgetting to monitor myself, I watched him as avidly as the others. "What a fine time we've had," Mrs. Bond said when he stood to leave. "So we did," he said. "There's a barn social Saturday night. Will you ladies be there?" "I'd say we will if it don't rain," Mrs. Bond said. Whatever was happening to me, I wanted it to keep happening, like I'd never wanted anything in my life.